Hi, my name is Suzanne Lee. I'm a pediatric rheumatologist at the Joseph M. Sansari Children's Hospital at Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine in Hackensack, New Jersey. And I'm really very happy to talk to you about my project developing classification criteria for juvenile systemic sclerosis, an international effort to enable pediatric-focused clinical trials.
Can you describe for us, in layman's terms, why your research project is promising for children and parents living with scleroderma?
Okay, thank you. So similar to adult onset disease, juvenile onset systemic sclerosis is one of the most severe pediatric rheumatic diseases. It's associated with substantial morbidity and a significant mortality risk. In the prospective North American registry run by the Pediatric Rheumatology organization called CARA, Childhood Arthritis and Rheumatology Research Alliance, over a third of the children and teens in that prospective registry had limited function at some time, which is a much higher frequency than was found for the other major pediatric rheumatic diseases such as lupus, dermatomyositis, and juvenile arthritis. So there's a great need to improve the care and outcome of the patients or the kids with juvenile systemic sclerosis. No clinical trials have been conducted in juvenile systemic sclerosis, so care recommendations are based upon extrapolation from adult trials and also trials of other pediatric rheumatic diseases. But there's many differences in disease pattern between juvenile and adult onset disease, so this is really suboptimal. And these differences include a much higher frequency of diffuse cutaneous subtype and overlap subtype in the kids versus adults. In adults, the limited cutaneous is the most common subtype. In adults, the diffuse cutaneous subtype is associated with the anti-scleroderma 70 antibody, while this antibody is much less common in kids, even though it's the most common subtype. So there's differences in the disease pattern. In addition, the diffuse cutaneous in adults is associated with poor prognosis. Well, fortunately, the frequency of major internal organ involvements and mortality is much, much lower in kids. Okay, but kids have these unique problems. So a major one that we're concerned about is their growth and development. So this disease is affecting things like their ability to eat normally. So in that CARE registry, 28% of the kids had malnutrition, which is extremely high and really frightening. And so they're not going to grow normally if they can't absorb the nutrients. In addition, they have problems such as arthropathy, muscle atrophy, decreased bone growth. So their childhood and their adult life can be severely impacted if we don't improve upon these things. So we're aiming to develop high-performing classification criteria. And this is a key tool needed for clinical trials when we don't have a diagnostic test. So the classification criteria serve to ensure that we have this well-characterized group of people with the disease of interest that we're studying. And we found that the existing adult classification criteria is suboptimal for classifying kids with systemic sclerosis. It performed much poorer than it does perform for adult patients. And we think that this is related to differences between juvenile onset and adult onset disease, and that we will be able to generate classification that are much better at identifying the kids with juvenile systemic sclerosis so that we'll be in a much better shape to be able to conduct the clinical trials.
What would you say is a particularly innovative aspect of this project?
So I think the most innovative part of our project is that we formed this international group of investigators. So it's been very exciting that we actually have investigators from 5 major continents. Unfortunately, the Australian collaborator became short-staffed, so that dropped out. Otherwise, but we have investigators from over 40 investigators from 18 countries, and they're located in South America, Central America, North America, Europe, Asia, Africa. So really very diverse group. And so I think that this is very exciting because we're going to form a consortium of our pediatric scleroderma experts, which we're still trying to decide on the name, but the current favorite is PICS for Pediatric International Consortium for Scleroderma. And this would be our first project, but then the idea is that, we're working together. We have another project that's going on to develop outcome measure standards for trials. And so, this project with that project would then lead us to be able to start doing clinical trials next. And by developing classification criteria that are based on the worldwide population of kids with juvenile systemic sclerosis, then we can really do international trials and we could really raise the care standards worldwide, which I think is very exciting.
If you had to kind of boil it down in one sentence, what's the most important question you want to address with this project?
So the most important question is we want to know if we can develop valid and high performing classification criteria for juvenile systemic sclerosis. So it's not so much a typical, I think, like basic science research question, but I hope we're certainly going to try very hard to make that answer yes and stuff.
How does this work build on work you've done so far in your career?
I think that I've been studying pediatric scleroderma since 2005, and so these are rare diseases, and so you have to learn how to collaborate well with other people, and you have to identify people to collaborate with. So I've led or co-led um, work groups within that CARA, that Pediatric Rheumatology Network. I was the chairperson for one of the disease committees, the Scleroderma Vasculitis and Rare Disease Committee, for 6 years. And under my chairmanship, I grew our disease committee. So we had like 5 disease work groups, and I really wanted to foster more. So one of the ones I was happy to try to promote and encourage to form was the juvenile systemic sclerosis work group. And so we grew from 5 to 8 work groups in that time, and we had many more members join. So I think that, I learned how to encourage people to get excited about working together. I've also, certainly read a lot more and learned a lot of different methodological approaches, because my prior training was more in basic science. So this was really very different. And, I had very, I guess, simplistic idea initially how to do things. And then you learn that, okay, you really need to get people who know this much better for doing something. So that's partly why I think this project is likely to succeed, because we were able to recruit great people for our steering committee, one of them being Sindhu Johnson, who led the adult effort to develop, to revise the adult systemic sclerosis classification criteria. So she's an excellent person to guide us for developing it for juvenile systemic sclerosis.
How do you see this work impacting the field of pediatric scleroderma?
I think it's going to have a major impact. And I think I'm saying that partly based upon like the enthusiasm I've gotten from the other collaborators, right? So, the grants, so it's difficult, right, to have contracts with over 40 investigators from 18 countries, right? So and I can't pay all these investigators because that would take the whole time of the grant if we were to try to arrange that, right? So these people are essentially working for free out of the goodness of their heart. And that's because they believe so strongly that this is really important. So many people have commented that there's such a need. They're really thankful that, this project is happening. They're really anticipating that this is going to make a major difference. I also think that the fact that we can have so many people working together, we're just going to learn so much from each other, right? That people are doing things differently, the populations are going to be different, so that we can also just raise the level of care just by sharing what we know, right? But like I said, we're going to be forming this consortium, so I'm really trying to encourage people that we are going to, do many works, right? So it's a broad name. It's not just for systemic sclerosis. It's for pediatric scleroderma, because we also want to study the juvenile localized scleroderma, which has much poorer outcome than the adult form of localized scleroderma, and people are very excited about that too. So, so I'm hopeful that we're just going to interest more people to go into scleroderma research. Hopefully, more translational people also, and then and young people, and then also to just encourage like subgroups within our consortium to just sort of say, oh, I have this idea, and like maybe we could do this, right? Sort of how the adult scleroderma clinical trials consortium has done so much fabulous work, right? I hope that we can use them as a model to build what we do in pediatrics.
What got you interested in scleroderma research?
So in 2005, I had a 4-year-old girl that had a linear scleroderma lesion on her leg, and I thought, oh, she's 4, so I'm worried that she could get a leg length difference or joint problem. So I want to understand what's the best way to treat this, right? So I thought that, okay, that'll take a year, right? Which of course was totally misguided. But then I started around the standard treatment, which was sort of intravenous steroids and methotrexate. And after the first month of treatment, she got a new lesion. So it was like, okay, this is clearly not going well. And then I thought I have to try to figure out how to better assess her long term, because the disease is not just the skin, it's often the deeper tissues like the bone, the joint. And so we tried to do MRI imaging of her at the next infusion because she's 4. We don't want to stick her too many times, right? She had to be sedated. And she actually became like psychotic from the combination of the steroids and the sedation, tried to break their car window. And so it was like, okay, MRI is clearly not going to be the way to monitor her. And I talked to one of the radiologists at our center, pediatric radiologist, and I explained the problem. And she said, why don't we try ultrasound? And so then the following month, after she got another month of treatment, we did ultrasound, and that showed more findings than the MRI had the month before. And it's non-invasive, you don't have to sedate. So then that just started this, oh, let's explore this as an outcome measure. So then, formed a group, got some grant support, and brought other pediatric rheumatologists and radiologists together to try to see if we could study this some. And then of course, since I'm a clinician, I wanted to work more with the clinicians, like, okay, now we're going to figure out what's the best treatment and stuff like that. So it just, made me realize that we need better outcome measures. We need this. We need to better characterize the disease. What are the issues? What are the subsets that respond better to treatment or don't? So it just kept going.
Looking back over almost, I can't believe 2005 is almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's more hope for children living with scleroderma now?
I think so. So I think that the when I started, I guess part of what bothered me in the literature for localized scleroderma was that systemic sclerosis is like one of the worst diseases. So people just kept minimizing localized scleroderma, saying it's not a big idea. It's not a big deal because it's not systemic sclerosis. And yes, you could say that about almost anything compared to systemic sclerosis. It's not that bad compared to systemic sclerosis. But for kids, they can end up with a shorter leg, facial hemiatrophy, seizures. It's not so benign. And the idea is that since we have treatments that work, if you can identify these patients earlier, you can really make an impact on their outcome. So I think that, we try to work towards raising awareness, but also just trying to, again, work towards figuring out what's the optimal treatment. So, we spent 2 years trying to develop some standardized regimens that we could study in comparative effectiveness study. And I think, that was extremely painful to try to reach consensus. But the good thing was that, people ended up having this mind shift, right? Like, even though what I've been doing works, it's not necessarily that's the only thing that'll work, right? That people got more willing to accept that, let's try to figure out come to some agreement on standards so we could just try it. And then, we try this, and if that's not so good, we'll throw that one out and we'll add a new one. And so that we could work forward towards improving outcome. But also I think it just raised awareness of like there are all these problems in these kids. And so just because you don't see it on the skin doesn't mean that they're all fine. Okay. And then obviously systemic sclerosis, everyone realized was very bad. But then I think people were just really worried what to do with these kids without sort of figuring out like how do we move forward with trying to, figure out how to better manage them, how to better treat them, how to better assess them. And again, I think, we've learned a lot from the adult groups, as well as I think the localized scleroderma work has benefited the systemic sclerosis, because the people that are interested in localized scleroderma tend to be interested in systemic sclerosis, so that you can have a work group that is willing to try things.
What would you consider to be your most significant research accomplishments or kind of the impact of your work to date?
I think that maybe raising awareness of the frequency of extracutaneous involvement, extracutaneous morbidity in the juvenile localized scleroderma. So again, I think that many people minimized it because the adult form tends to be superficial, the kids form tends to be deep. And the pediatric rheumatology, like the seminal paper that talked about extracutaneous involvement, they reported a frequency of like 22%. Okay. But then when we were doing our prospective studies, we were finding much higher percentages, like 50, 70%. And the seminal paper was based on retrospective people reporting in their patients. And then we actually made a table in one of our papers to compare the differences between them. And then we realized that they were leaving out so many morbidities. So when they said musculoskeletal, they were only including arthritis. So they didn't include joint contractures that were not inflammatory. They didn't include leg length differences. They didn't include muscle atrophy. So if we took out all those things, we also got 20%. But if we put all those things in, we were getting like 50 to 70%. So I think, just trying to raise that awareness with organizations. And then I think because of that frequency, we also showed that having extracutaneous involvement is not just bad because you could end up with this shorter limb, but it's also associated with poor response to treatment, that you have activity that persists for longer, you need more treatment. So, which sort of, intuitively sort of makes sense that if you have deeper tissue, it's probably going to be harder to get rid of than if it's more superficial. So I think just trying to, start to dissect who are going to be the responders, because about 70% of the kids respond to the standard treatment of methotrexate with or without steroids, which is sort of like the same frequency of arthritis people responding. I sort of feel like it's the magic number in rheumatology. 70% respond to a given treatment, so 30% don't. And so if we can identify those 30% that don't, then we could sort of maybe strategize sooner, when should we switch over? These are the people that you want to watch more. And then I think along those lines, we developed a measure to track extracutaneous involvement. So that again was a CARA effort. So I feel very proud of that measure, because I think that this will enable us to actually do clinical trials to look at extracutaneous involvement, because now we can sort of standardize how we assess it.
What do you see yourself working on 10 years from now?
I think education advocacy is really important, right? So I think trying to raise awareness, not just with the pediatric rheumatologists that I think, we've sort of raised awareness, but we actually want to raise awareness with pediatricians, with dermatologists, with family practice doctors, internists, right? That these patients, are not just, it sort of upsets me when my juvenile localized scleroderma patients graduate from my clinic, and then, one of them has like peripheral neuropathy. She has weakness, she has terrible pain, and she gets sent to the dermatology clinic at Mayo Clinic, right? I just think that's really inappropriate, right? She she doesn't just have a skin disease. She has all these other problems, and you're sending her to the dermatologist only, right? So I just think we have to raise awareness so we can improve the care for these patients long term. And then I'm hoping that this consortium will really take off, and so that I'll be involved in some exciting clinical trial work and stuff like that. So
What do you consider some of the biggest kind of hot topics in pediatric scleroderma research today?
I think Dr. Torick's work in translational work, right, being able to do single cell analysis is super exciting. I think that just seems like the way that we're going to be able to get to personalized medicine, as well as identify new medications for treatment. I think that in terms of clinical work, I think it's very exciting that there's been just so much more collaboration between sites, so that we have a lot of partnerships with the European Society, the Pediatric Rheumatology European Society Press, and they're also doing translational studies in the UK and elsewhere, so that there's collaborate and Italy. So I feel like we're just going to build more networks of clinical and translational work that should be partnered together. I I'm hopeful about that. I think that juvenile systemic sclerosis has been slow to get moving, but I think we're getting um, more clinical work done. So one of the ones I mentioned before, which is led by Natalia Vasquez Canizares at Montefiore in New York City, is trying to define outcome measures for clinical trials in juvenile systemic sclerosis. And that's based on a scoping literature review. And, there were like 25,000 papers that we had to sort through. So it was a lot. And again, we're so fortunate to have like over 30 collaborators from like a dozen countries that are participating in this. And then we had so much enthusiasm that initially we thought, okay, we're just going to focus on like two areas like Raynaud's and maybe skin. And then, all these collaborators saying, no, why limit it, right? So then we ended up having 6 areas, right? So we have skin, musculoskeletal, we have heart, we have lung, we have GI, um, we have Raynaud's, and we have health-related quality of life. So we have 6 work groups that when we sorted out that 25,000 papers, we ended up with like 30 to 80 papers. So each of those 6 groups would look through that to see which which ones were potentially to include for extraction. And then it's still a lot. Like Marenka Twillt, who's done tremendous number of literature reviews, told us, oh yeah, we'll have under 100. So of course it's not under 100. It's like between 150 and 300 articles we have to extract. So it's a tremendous amount of effort that is being expended. But it's just like very heartwarming that so many people are still continuing to do this. And again, I think it's just like, again, this feeling that there's a real need for us to do more for these kids, and we really want to do more. So I just feel like that's such a we're really building this community of people that care so much for doing more.
If you had unlimited resources, I don't know if this is an uplifting or a depressing question. What problem would you want to solve?
I think, of course, we all want to cure the disease, right? I think if we had unlimited resources, I think the best use might be putting it to spreading out the funds between so many different clinical centers, so that we can actually have support to capture all this clinical data, and ideally capture all this sample data on these patients, so that it's sort of just making this registry, this bank, where then people can mine that going forward, right? Because we don't really know so much the long-term outcome. We don't know what are the risks for the person who's going to respond, not respond. But as we understand more, we'll start identifying that. So would of course be super helpful if you had that resource to go back to and then to pull out these samples and let's see if we can identify a difference, as well as just having a larger data bank to begin with, means it's much easier to tell what are the disease patterns of the responders, the non-responders, or the person who's likely to develop lung disease or something like that. You'll be much better able to tell that. So, and again, I think it's just nice if we could make this more global than just at a few centers, because you could better ensure that the population you're reporting on is really reflective of what's seen worldwide.
I hope you enjoyed learning more about the important work being supported through our peer-reviewed research grants program. We're incredibly grateful to our team of investigators for the work they do to discover the cause, understand the mechanism, and overcome scleroderma forever. The National Scleroderma Foundation is the leading nonprofit supporter of peer-reviewed research in the country. Since our founding in 1998, the foundation has committed over $30 million to scleroderma research. The need to accelerate the pace of discovery in scleroderma is urgent, and we're proud of our leadership role in advancing scientific innovation. Our program prioritizes scientific merit and provides funding for both early career and established investigators. By leveraging the integrity of the peer review process, we can ensure that we are supporting the most impactful science in the scleroderma research community. And when you invest in the Foundation's research program, you can ensure that your resources are being carefully stewarded every step of the way. Thank you for your support of our research programs, and thank you to our investigators for making a difference in the lives of people living with scleroderma.